Hey everyone, and welcome back to the studio. Let's paint something new and different today, metal. This cool little brass bowl is a favorite of mine, so I'll walk you through the ways that I paint both it and other metal stuff in general. Let's go! Let's start off by spreading some medium onto the panel in a nice thin coat. Some people have asked what the texture is on these panels of mine. It's just a super thin wash of acrylic paint applied with a foam paint roller. With the panel prepped, it's time to start drawing our brass bowl. I'll grab some burnt umber and ivory black, thin it out with some medium, and I'll start this line drawing. I always like to begin drawing by placing little reference points on the panel. To better help me get the proportions right, and because we're painting a symmetrical, human-made object here, I'll also draw myself a center line. This gives me a reference point for the entire drawing and helps ensure that I get this bowl symmetrical, mostly. I'll often use a T-square to get super accurate center lines, but I felt comfortable freehanding this one. With the center line in, I'll continue the drawing with the rest of the reference points, comparing their relative distance from the center line and adjusting things to ensure accuracy. I'll also denote where the different features of the bowl land on this center line, the lower ledge, where the neck meets the body, and the top rim, and draw those in as well. You'll see I adjust things a few times here. The big lower ledge felt too low compared to the point where the neck meets the body of the bowl. I simply draw in the adjustment, then I'll erase the original line later. With a few landmarks in place, it's time to draw the outer line of the bowl. Again, I'm comparing the line work of each side to each other using the center line as my guide. I'm constantly gauging the distance of the lines that I'm drawing from that center, making sure that this thing is as symmetrical as possible. Just a quick reminder of the paint that I'm using. This is just a mixture of burnt umber and black, thinned out with some medium so it flows nicely. As I work, I'm almost flicking my eyes back and forth between the line I'm currently drawing and the lines I've already put in place. I want the negative space between these lines and the center line to match. I'll use the same techniques to find the outer points of the rim of the bowl with hash marks, then draw that top ledge. Once I have the majority of the drawing in place, I notice that the proportions are a little wonky. While I adjust the curvature of the bottom, I want to point out that I do tend to exaggerate the shape of this bowl. I like to make it a little curvier with some sharper points. I just think it makes an already interesting subject that much more so. You'll notice again that I make the change to the drawing, but I leave the original lines. If I were to erase the old lines first, I'd run the risk of repeating the same mistake. Once the drawing is adjusted, I'll come back with a paint eraser tool, remove old lines, and lighten up some of the heavier paint in the correct ones. I'll also draw the shape of the shadow that's being cast by the bowl onto the table, and I'll block it in with this same mixture of paints. Now that the bones of the painting are in place, I'll draw the shape of the shadow being cast by the rim onto the body of the bowl. I'll also erase some of the heavy line work on the rim itself, and it'll be time to get into mixing some shadow color. I'll grab a combination of raw umber, burnt sienna, and ochre to mix a warm shadow color that's just slightly lighter than our drawing mixture. I'll bring this up to the painting and start blocking in the shadows, leaving a small, unpainted line representing the lip of the rim. This shadow will darken where it meets the body of the bowl and where it wraps around to the right, so I'll add a touch more black into the mix. The underside of the bowl is very dark on the right side, so I'll start blocking that in as well. I'm making sure to keep this paint pretty thin. A good, strong oil painting has thin, semi-transparent shadows and thick, opaque lights. This gives a painting a sculptural, three-dimensional look and feel. It will, however, start to lighten up as it wraps around to the left, so I'll gradually lighten the shadow value with bits of ochre and burnt sienna to show that. What this starts to represent as well is all of the reflected light that's being bounced up into this surface from the table. I want the brightest, purest color in this shadow to be right under where the highlight is on the ridge above. Again, just adding a bit more ochre and sienna to get that nice, brassy metal color and brighter value. You'll notice I'm ignoring that sticker on the bottom left. I tried to get that thing off, but it's really stubborn, so I pretend it isn't there. As my block in of this big shadow nears completion, you can already start to get a sense of form in this bowl. We're establishing a very basic first step in finding the relationship between light and dark. I'll move on to the shadow on the body next. To block in the cast shadow on the body, I'll darken this mixture with some ivory black and both of the umbers. This cast shadow will be darker where it meets the neck of the bowl and be slightly lighter as it moves away from that point. I'll also cool it down with some white at its furthest point on the right side. This paint is all pretty thin. I want to reserve the thickest paint for the lightest areas and the highlights. With all the shadows blocked in, I'll start to mix paint for the light parts of the brass. I'll start with some ochre and burnt sienna mixed into our shadow colors. I want this to be warmer than the shadow. The value here will also be the first step up and out of the dark towards the light. As I start making some brush strokes for this, I want to point out something very important when painting metal. The majority of a metal object is much darker than you'd think. It's the stark contrast between both the colorful highlights and reflected light and these dark midtones and shadows that really pushes that sense of the reflective surface. The reference image is, unfortunately, a little blown out and overexposed. Try as I might to correct this, my camera just couldn't accurately capture the range of values that I saw in person. But keep that in mind as a rule of thumb. To make something look reflective, keep most of it dark, but really push the highlights bright. You'll see what I mean as I work through this. In general, what I want this brass to do is warm up as it approaches the highlights and cool down as the form turns away. This bowl is dusty, which helps that concept immensely. I'll cool off my brassy paint mixture with ivory black and touches of white to start to show that dust. To warm up the color, I'll simply start adding more ochre, burnt sienna, and some touches of burnt umber. I'm also using a lot of raw umber in all of these mixtures. It serves as the backbone for a lot of the color that I see in this bowl. As I'm rendering this big chunk of light that's hitting the brass, I'm just keeping a few things in mind. I'm ignoring the big highlights in the lightest areas for now. I want to really establish a good mid-tone with some dynamic color. I'm focusing on mixing paint that warms up in the areas around the highlights and darkens and cools down as it wraps around to the edges. I'll warm it up with burnt umber and sienna and cool it down with raw umber and black. I'm also balancing the amount of texture I have in these brushstrokes. I want good, chunky paint, but I also want a decently smooth gradient between color temperatures and changes in value. You'll see me come back and soften a few things to get that effect. I want the brightest, purest color to be right around the main highlight on the front ridge. I'll start lightening my paint with even more ochre and add touches of titanium yellow to really brighten it. These values transition smoothly into the surroundings, so you'll see that I soften some things to get that gradient. At this point, I want to start showing some of that great brass color in the lightest areas. I'll grab some ochre, but mix bits of cadmium lemon and orange into it to boost the saturation of color. I'll let some chunky brush strokes of this start to show that great metal texture in the highlights. To really go for the brightest highlights, I'll grab some titanium yellow and a bit of white. Around those, I'll add more of the cadmiums to really get that brassy glow. Again, if you squint your eyes at the painting right now, you'll see that it's mostly dark with the exception of the highlights I just put in. This is good. It allows me room to add some really bright, pure color in select areas, which will give this a punchy, metallic sheen. Background time. I want this color to be complementary to the brass and push the sense of warmth in the metal. I'll mix a combination of raw umber, ivory black, and bits of ochre, titanium yellow, and white to get a cool, neutral, gray-green. I'm mixing a lot of paint here because I want a nice, consistent color throughout the entire background. My first attempt was a bit too dark, so I'll come back and lighten it up a bit. My pool of paint was also expanding all over the palette, so I used my palette knife to recollect it into a more manageable pool. I want the background to be pretty thin, so there's a lot of medium mixed into this paint. I'll use it to cut in around the shape of the brass bowl and block in the entire background. This nice, scrubby old brush is really great for massing in big areas like this. I'll flip the panel over to allow me to more accurately make the brushstrokes I need against the left side of the brass. You'll also notice I'm leaving a blank space for the sliver of light that the rim of the bowl is catching. We'll work back into that next. The lip of the rim is catching a really nice little highlight, so I'll grab some of the bright brass color that I've already used. This rim will be brightest and warmest around the highlight and will darken and cool down as it wraps around to the left and right. This shows the cylindrical form on the lip. I'll paint some of the nice, cool dust that's on this bowl. I'll cool down some of my brass mixture and start to paint the dust on the left side. I don't want this to be as bright as my highlight, but it will get brighter as it approaches the lightest parts of the bowl. I want these brushstrokes to show some texture, but I also want this dust to soften nicely into the already established paints. This is very similar to how I paint grapes. If you haven't watched that video, check it out. The dust on the right side will be even cooler and slightly darker than the left. If this gets too bright, it'll flatten the form. I want it to be much more subtle. Again, just letting it blend softly into the existing paint. The brightest dust will be right around the highlight and will also get darker as it moves away. I'm being very selective with how much of this dust I'm showing in the painting. I want it to be more of a suggestion rather than blanketing the entire surface and losing all of that nice brass color. You can see that I'll reestablish some of that bright color around the highlight as I work in that area. I'll come back into the shadows now to show the reflected light that's being bounced up into them from the table. I see these as being pretty cool and fairly bright, though still relatively dark compared to the rest of the painting. The reflections in the reference image are a little overblown. I want mine to be a little bit more subtle. I'm using careful brush strokes here, letting this reflected light softly blend into the existing shadow. I don't want too many hard edges. This should be softer and more mysterious than the light areas of the painting. I'll also come back with some bright, pure color around the highlights to push them one step further. There's also some great light being bounced up into the underside of the lip. Some burnt sienna and ochre will show this. There's a cooler version of this on the right side of the lip as well. I again don't want these to be too bright, they're still in shadow. I added the brightest highlight to the rim and decided I wanted to show a bit of glow coming off of it. I'll warm up and lighten my background color with some ochre and, using some gentle brush strokes, add that to the background right around that highlight. I let these brush strokes softly blend into the background. I'll also soften the edges of the cast shadow on the table with the transitional value, slightly lighter than the shadow, but darker than the background. At this point, the painting is just about wrapped up. I'll re-establish the highlight on the rim, adjust a few values in the glow, dust, and purest colors, and call it finished. As we check out the brushwork up close, I just want to say thank you as always for watching. These videos are a blast to make. I really love sharing my process for some of my favorite painting subjects. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me paint next. Thank you again, and I'll catch you all in the next one.